The ryegrass are genetically similar enough to each other that they can cross-pollinate. It might be sort of the difference between a beef cow and a Holstein. In that sense, you can cross them, but they're very different in terms of what they do. But it's not a great analogy because the fundamental difference between Italian ryegrass and annual ryegrass is that the Italian ryegrass will grow vegetatively like this in the first year. It won't try to put up a seed head. Annual ryegrass will. Intermediate ryegrass will. And one of the confusing things is that there are some Italian ryegrasses that are supposed to grow like that all year that in some environments put up seed heads anyway, or they're just mislabeled. They're both high quality. You just have to watch the seed heads. And with orchard grass, if you get seed heads, you're in trouble. With Italian ryegrass, you have some higher fiber, but it's probably something more like 53 instead of 63% NDF. Okay, so it's more forgiving even though it gets ugly. The other thing is the annual ryegrass will give you a bigger first cut, and it won't give you as much for cuttings after that. So there might be a place for somebody. It's a different kind of tool. It's not one, if I want to maximize yield and quality, I'll pick an Italian. If I want something that's going to give me a big first cut yield and then do something else with it, then annual would probably be a better choice. So just some basics. You see right here, this is what the annual is going to do in the first year, and the Italian is going to stay like this. Grown around the world. In the UK, they're pretty popular. I think they grow quite a bit, and they use some of the perennial ryegrasses in New Zealand, which we'll talk about perennial a little bit. There are various types, and they can reproduce or cross-pollinate. Seed costs are generally pretty low. The vigor is the most vigorous cool season grass that you can get that is a small seeded crop. So yeah, I mean, triticale, spring wheat, those are going to be super aggressive because they have a big seed to get them going. But this is really not much different, in my opinion. They're very nutrient responsive, and so if you decide beforehand that I'm going to feed this thing, just like you decide beforehand I'm going to feed my dairy cows, then it'll serve you well. But it's very similar to a dairy cow in that if you don't feed it properly, it's not going to produce for you. Okay, it will show you every place in your field where your fertility is lacking. So, and it likes water. So if you have a super sandy field or you're in some kind of spot that doesn't get much rain, typically it's not a great fit. So here's cereal rye seeds, and here's Italian ryegrass or annual ryegrass seed, just for comparison. Disease resistance is another important factor that we'll talk about a little bit later. There's a disease called crown rust that it can take the sugars out of the plant, because anywhere you have a foliar disease, the sugars are gone, fiber digestibility is lower, and it's going to affect probably your regrowth as well. I can't really emphasize enough how necessary it is to plant early. So when's the earliest you'd see down around here?
Early May, late April.
Okay, I just get it in as early as you can get in the field, and plant it as shallow as you can. It can come up from a pretty deep seed placement, but it will be slow because it's not huge. It's more forgiving for this deeper depths than say orchard grass probably would be. But planting early, and if you plant it deep, it's like planting 2 weeks later. So plant it shallow if you're going to go to the trouble of getting it out there. It loves nitrogen, and we're going to see some really short cutting schedules. So on your perennial crops, what's a short cutting schedule? If you're really aggressive, you're after the super high energy levels. 35 days is short, really. What kind of grasses are you guys growing?
I guess native.
Native. Did you know there are hardly any native grasses around here? I mean, yeah, almost all of them are European. But anyway, yeah. fescue. So, I mean, native, probably a lot of people are thinking Kentucky bluegrass and some orchard grass that's out there.
There's a lot of Vermont that didn't see the cloud for a lot of years because they finally got the stones fixed.
Rocks, yeah.
And
Yep, no, I understand.
you just keep the manure and the fertilizer to it.
Yep.
You don't know, it's a mix of everything.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and you can get some really good quality off of that. You really can. The fiber digestibility is very high. So how many of you pay attention to the 30-hour NDFD on your forage test reports? You look at that, basically how much fiber you can expect to disappear inside the cow, be utilized by the cow in 30 hours. Also, we're going to look at something called total tract NDF digestibility. And that's a new measurement that University of Wisconsin came up. It's basically saying, well, 30 hours is nice, but I'm really wanting to know how much of that fiber disappears in the entire digestive tract of that animal. And that parameter, you don't really find it in ration balancing software, but you can use it to compare one species or one variety to another before you even bother seeding down. It's an important number. And they are related to 30 hours. They kind of correlate. And it's high in sugars and starches, especially for that first cut, like a lot of other grasses are. So this is kind of what you'll see when it's ready to harvest. Some people will ask, how tall does it need to be before you take that first cut? And because I said it has high NDFD, what does it mean it's low N if it has high digestibility? What's that re-rod of the plant that's indigestible? Lignin, right? So lignin is what the BMR corn is, less lignin, more prone to lodging. This is relatively low in lignin, and so it tends to flop over more. So it's never going to get this tall. It's going to get about this tall, and then it's going to start kind of piling up. So those leaves might be 21 to 24 inches long before you take that first cut. But still, if you stuck a yardstick in, it might only be 14 inches tall. So I've been talking to some people about how I think we could stand to mow a little bit higher with some of the orchard grasses. And I think people are seeing that. It rebounds a little quicker.
Starting to learn more about cutting height and regrowth.
Yeah, right. But we had Dan Understander on from University of Wisconsin, and you'll see him in Hordes Dairyman and other places writing articles. He has a lot more experience with Italian ryegrass than I do, and he says 2 inches is fine because it stores a lot of the energy in the crown. I was telling the farmers do it more like 4 inches. And, it doesn't hurt probably, but I would at least experiment with 2 on some strips just to see if it's really any different. Otherwise, it's digestible enough. I wouldn't hesitate to drop it down and take it as long as I wasn't getting too much dirt in there with it. Increasing
pounds per acre.
We'll talk about that a little bit because that's a big question. Depending on the literature you read, you'll see recommendations between 20 and 45 pounds of seed per acre. So it's cheap per pound, but if you're putting on 45 pounds per acre, well, that's not cheap anymore. What's that?
That's double what you normally put on.
Right. We'll talk about that though. So this is going to be for a haylage system. You're not going to want to try to make dry hay out of this. It's got a pretty waxy cuticle. You see how shiny that is in that picture? And that just makes it more difficult for it to dry out. So you need to be thinking about, this is going to be for haylage, and if you're going to do this, as you'll see, the forage quality is pretty different. The cutting schedule is different. You're going to want to think about segregating this, whether it's in a different ag bag, different pile of wrapped around bales, or a different bunker, which I know is harder to do because you don't have extra. What's that?
What about grazing?
Yeah, I'll show you a slide in here where some grazing was done. I think one of the tricks with this, and you'd have to work with a nutritionist, the fiber levels are so low that it just flies through cows that are grazing. I mean, just flies through them. So you have to slow it down somehow if you want to capture that value, because it doesn't do any good if they can't absorb those nutrients. So that might, for a grazing animal, I might say make sure they have a good rumen mat. Feed them something after you milk them that's a little higher fiber. Not a nutritionist, but that might help slow it down because when they go out, they're probably going to like it. But all right, so we'll talk about the monoculture first. Later, we're going to talk about it as a companion crop, but as a monoculture, where it's just Italian ryegrass. Again, plant as early as you can. Plant it shallow. I like the idea of using a brilliant if you can, just because you're going to get better light interception, probably a better first cut. Make sure your soil test reports are looking good going in, and I wouldn't put any nitrogen fertilizer on until the grass is up about that tall, 3 or 4 inches tall, because those roots aren't going to be able to capture that nitrogen from the fertilizer that early. If you have, especially if you have manure in the field, that should be enough to get it started. But my fear is if you put it on too early, you're planning on it being there, and then it starts to turn yellow because that nitrogen left a long time ago. You don't want that to happen, because that's going to delay your first cut. It's going to be lower quality and smaller yield. Be ready for short harvest intervals. A guy who used to farm in Vermont, who I know is farming in Wisconsin now, I talked with him. He's planted about 300 acres of this. I asked him, because I saw some data from Wisconsin where their interval was as short as 14 days, which I can't even imagine. I said, so tell me, what's your shortest interval? He said probably 17 days is the shortest. So that's happening. You're taking your first cut about 45 days after you plant it. So think about what's happening. You plant it, just say May 1st for easy dates. So June 15th is your first cut. And then it has established itself. You're putting more nitrogen fertilizer on it. The days are very long. So it has great growing conditions. So your days to your second cutting is going to be pretty short. Third cutting a little longer, fourth cutting a little longer, because the days are getting shorter, and that's just how it seems to work. But it's not going, you're not going to maximize your yield if you say, well, I'll just harvest it at the same time as my other cool season grasses. You can still do that. It'll still be probably pretty good quality, but you're not going to maximize your yield because you're not putting more fertilizer out there and letting it capture sunlight with the regrowth.
Like manure?
It likes manure, and I asked the farmer who's been managing it in Wisconsin what his take on that was. Like any grass, it can take the manure. The question is, how is your traffic? What are the soil conditions? So you're going to injure the plant if you are on there with really wet soils and things like that. If you put it into a killed sod or something like that, which I'm not sure why you would do that, but if you were trying to make those quote native grasses, those fields produce a little bit more, you take those out, no-till into it, that would hold you up pretty well. It's just that if it has 1 year's worth of growth, which it's all that it's going to give you, that's not nearly it doesn't have the ability to keep you afloat as well as a perennial sod does. So you just have to watch that. I didn't see any issue with it this year, really. Yeah, I mean, you could tell where the tractor drove, where the spreader went, just like you can with a perennial grass, I guess. But you need to pay attention to that. And I don't think I mentioned this. This is really important. This you manage as an annual crop. You don't expect it to come up the next year any more than you expect your corn to come back the next year. The difference is sometimes this will and your corn never will. It just depends on the year. If it survives the winter, it's going to want to put up seed heads the second year, but you don't count on that. And so if you have that expectation, you're going to be disappointed. I talked with one farmer last year, and I asked him if he wanted to try some, because some companies had donated seed because I wanted to do these projects, and he said, I didn't come up again. And that's just how it is. It doesn't. So that said,
but it's there for soil erosion through the winter months.
Yeah, it's there for soil erosion through the winter months. And if you wanted to survive the winter, the way you do that, the way you maximize the chances of that, is you take your last cut as late as possible and as low as possible. Because what it doesn't know how to do is it doesn't know when to quit. It just keeps growing into the fall and piling up dry matter. And so if you say, I'll take my last cut, what's your last cut for your perennial crops here? A typical date.
We did some after corn this year, last year.
Okay. What for the average?
Week October.
Oh, really? Okay. Anybody else a different date than that? Okay. Well, if you're doing it then, you're probably fine. But if a person's calling it quits sometime in September, you'll have a lot of accumulation. And you just need to understand that if you want it to survive, you do that. And it still might not. This year, we have these weird factors. We have warm weather, but no snow cover when we do get cold weather. So I don't know what that's going to do to it. So here we are. This was from Jericho, where Kirsten Workman cooperated with me to get this on-farm demonstration done. We had 4 different varieties: Green Spirit, Tetramag, Tetrapine, Totila. These 3 are from Seedway. This one is from Barenbrug. We didn't get that first cut data, and we had to calculate those values based on the fact that usually your first cut is going to be bigger. And so this is, again, calculated, but it's probably pretty close. Second cut, a 1.4, third cut, 1.7 tons, fourth cut, 1.0 tons. So for dry matter yield, that's pretty good for an annual, for the first year of any full season grass. And even though that was the case, my observation was that field, the seeds were placed too deep, and the nitrogen program could have been more aggressive, which are 2 things that you really don't know until you get some experience doing it. So what's a good dry matter yield for you guys here? Do you even think about dry matter yield as much as I was harvested? I mean, are you at 5 tons? 6, for cool season, 6 tons? Okay, so
Depends what kind of year you have.
yeah, for Jericho though,
Last
that's
year we got 4 cuttings pretty good on regular grasses.
yeah.
I don't know if you established something last year really with rainy and June, how well would it get?
Well, this May was really dry, so it didn't get going as well as it could have gotten. I don't think. Okay, well, what I was recommending was I think the hope was in that field that the manure would do the trick for the first cut. And I suggested, after looking at it, Kirsten went out there and in some plots broadcast some by hand and saw a visual response to that. But before each of the other cuts, at least before the second and third, 50 more pounds of actual N went down in the form of urea. And I don't know if they did that before the fourth cut or not.
Did they play a varying rates?
No, not here. This is not a formal replicated kind of study. It's just we're taking a look. These are observations. This other farm had I think they got planted late and they had a very lax kind of management, and that's, it is what it is. I'm sure it was good quality. They still liked it, but the yield wasn't there as it would have been if it had been planted early and managed on time. So just real quick, 1.7 tons times 2,000 pounds per ton times 22% protein times 16% of the protein is actual nitrogen. That's 120 pounds of nitrogen in the harvested portion. So it's hauling nitrogen out of the ground, and it really needs that if you're going to get those yields. So here in this plot, you can see this is the bottom right corner of the rectangle. This is the top left corner of the triangle, and I broadcast about 50 pounds of nitrogen there. And you can see manure has been applied in this field, and you can see just the nature of manure being applied. It's never perfectly uniform, and you can see it's blotchy. It's great where it's heavy, and part of that also could have been the seeds, where the places where the seeds were planted shallower are bigger, more mature. That could add to the blotchiness. But anywhere I put that fertilizer, you definitely got that response, and it would have been a bigger cutting earlier. All right, can it take manure? As somebody asked already. And this was, what did I say? August 3rd. This is what it looked like. That's when they were putting the manure on. Drag line with an airway. 10 days later, looking like that. And the question was, how does it take manure? Manure is fine, but I think I can see where he was driving the tractor there. I'm not sure how much. And this is kind of a sandy loam type of field. There's not a lot of clay in it. Forage quality. So protein levels, these are again, this is Jericho, June 12th, first cut. This was with the nitrogen. I think this was without. Putting nitrogen on boosts you definitely 6 points pretty easily in protein. But let's go over here. We see the non-fiber carbohydrate. That's your sugar, starch, pectin, anything that doesn't actually hold the plant up. That's completely usable by the animal. So for these different cuttings, Non-fiber carbohydrates are pretty good. This is the strength, the total tract NDF digestibility, or the 30-hour. We'll look at that first, since that's what you're familiar with. 82%. Again, this is Rock River Lab. Every lab is a little different in how they do things. But I think I can say I don't commonly see 30-hour digestibility that high. The total tract NDF digestibility is a completely different measurement. So you might wonder, how come more fiber is disappearing in 30 hours than disappears in the whole tract? How is that possible? Well, they're different measurements. Okay, so just forget all about 30-hour NDF now. Let's talk about the total tract number. So John Gazer from Rock River Lab, who also worked with David Combs from University of Wisconsin, talked about the total tract numbers. If it's above something like 50, you're doing pretty well. 55 is very good, and so it's way higher than that. And part of that, so we have the species. We also have the fact that it's Vermont. It's relatively cool. You don't have a lot of lignin going down. We have ample rainfall, so that contributes to that high total tract NDF digestibility, but it's very good. And then RFV, you ever look at RFV on your report? Does that mean anything to you? Okay, those numbers are pretty good. And relative forage quality is another index they came up with at University of Wisconsin that also takes into account total tract NDF digestibility, or I'm sorry, 30-hour NDF digestibility. All right, so the quality is good. Yield is pretty good, just depending on your management. And here are some ways, again, just to repeat: optimize it by planting early, shallow seed, careful nutrient management, be willing to take those short harvest intervals, plant disease-resistant varieties. If you want to maximize your yield, use the Italian instead of annual or intermediate, and try to manage for hay in a day. If you want to actually capture those non-fiber carbohydrates, how many of you try to do haylage in a day? Tough to do when you're knocking down how many acres in a day, right?
Try to get some of the moisture.
Yeah. So how about wide swathing? Do you wide swath? Wide swath. Okay, so if you wide swath, good. You might want to ted it still. You probably will want to ted it. And if you don't do wide swath, so a wide swath, just if you read different things, people will say wide swath is anything that is 70% more or more of your cutting width. So if you have a 10-foot mower and your windrow is 7 feet, most people would consider that wide swath. But some of them are as little as 40%. You leave a 4-foot windrow, and all that forage is piled up in the dark, and it's respiring, and it's using up those sugars. It doesn't dry very quickly. So ted it. Tedding is cheap, very cheap. You don't have to put your best employee on the tractor with a tedder, and to have them go over it twice. I think it's about $5 or $6 per acre is what it costs to ted. So if you're tedding and you're able to capture that quality, get it in storage in that same day, I think you will be much happier with the quality you get out of it. Be ready to ted it twice. All right, disease. All right, so this is crown rust. Anywhere you see one of these little lesions here, the sugars are gone, the fiber is less digestible. Two varieties out of the 3 Italians that we had severe crown rust later in the summer. One variety that did not have visible crown rust, or if it did, it was very, very, very small. Very big difference among the varieties. And it was only for that one cutting. Now, it could be because the plants were stressed, there weren't enough nutrients available. It could have been a combination of that, plus the high humidity and high temperatures. Hard saying, but I think it's worth seeking out a variety that has that kind of resistance, and it would be good to look at this again this year.
Get that on other varieties?
Yeah, you can. Orchard grass is a big one.
Yeah,
so very common. And there's an interaction with fertility. If it has adequate nitrogen, you're less likely to have that problem in a lot of grasses, some grasses anyway. But if you have cows on pasture especially, they don't want to go anywhere near. They'll graze pretty much everywhere else except where you have that. It's either unpalatable or they just know they don't get as much out of it. So.
How does this grass work and mix?
Good question. We're going to talk about that.
Area.
Excellent question. Well, I have some pictures of that. Oh, I'll also point out, so the annual ryegrasses did not get this crown rust, and I think part of it is that they are really revved up to try to produce seed. And I think likely it's the case that they fight it off a little better because of that. And they're not nearly as thick, and I think the protein levels are a little lower. All right, so this was an organic farm. They were trying to manage with just manure. And in a river bottom where there tends to be a lot of fog, and as we mentioned, the manure never goes on quite as uniformly as you want. So in those blotches, it had a lot less rust. Here, where there was less manure, it had a lot more rust. So here's the difference. Inadequate fertility, adequate fertility. So you see the impact of fertility on that disease. So I think you can use them in organic systems if you want to, but you really, I would probably pick a field that didn't have a high phosphorus level already and manage your nitrogen with poultry manure or something like that to keep the fertility where you need it. All right, 14 to 30 days. Gasp. Tough to even imagine. All right, so here, 2004, Arlington, Wisconsin, Italian ryegrass. June 15th was their first harvest date, which means they probably planted it around May 1st there. 1.7 tons per acre. How many days between June 15th and June 29th? About 14 days. 1.69 tons. Then June 29th to July 15th, 16 days or so. Okay, 2.49 tons of dry matter. I'm not saying that this is going to happen to anybody in Vermont. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that if you want to maximize your yield, you need to do what the crop tells you to do. It's saying harvest me, get it off the field, let it recover. And I've never, ever in the continental United States heard of dry matter yields that high for any grass crop. But that year they got that. Other years they're not that high, but they're still higher than most of the other grasses that you see.
What kind of soil pH?
I don't think the pH is all that different. I think it's a sandy loam, and they have, if you watch how things go across the lake, or before they come to Lake Michigan, a lot of clouds pile up there. I think they were getting good rainfall that year, must have had temperatures that weren't ridiculously high, so that the plants really never shut down, and they must have been getting a lot of fertilizer to it. But I'm pretty sure on the research farm, their pH would be pretty manageable. Yeah. And there are some varietal differences. I've never planted any of those varieties. All right, reasons you do it. If you wanted to rotate briefly away from corn, if that would help your T value on your nutrient management plan to allow you to continue managing in a certain way, you could rotate away from corn for a year and still get good dry matter and good forage quality. That's one reason. Or you just want the forage quality. Overcoming weed problems. So this was a field in Bradford area of Vermont where there was a burr cucumber issue. Anybody have a burr cucumber? What's the problem with burr cucumber? Why is it so nasty? It does that. What else? Okay, it makes it tough to harvest. What else? Anything? Okay, well, one of the things that makes it so that it actually escapes your weed control program is that those seeds keep germinating throughout the season. So your herbicide program takes out the first batch, but then they just keep coming, and they are pretty good at using low light situations, and they can create quite a tangle. So this field was just adjacent to the manure pit. There's also a fair amount of burr cucumber around the manure pit, so that's how the seed could be getting in the field in the first place. But the idea is that maybe if we take 4 or 5 cuttings off this field, we can pull down the seed bank of those burr cucumber seeds. Have you seen the seeds of burr cucumber? They're kind of a black and brown seed, really shiny, kind of a pretty seed actually, about that big, and they have lots of strength to push up through the ground. Companion crops, so planting it with something. This is where I compare them to a sharp knife. They're a great tool, but you can cut yourself badly if you don't use it properly. So the rule that you'll want to listen to from University of Wisconsin is that you want to keep your seeding rates, keep your Italian ryegrass rate down to 4 or 5 pounds per acre, probably 4 pounds per acre in your mix. Don't put more than 4 pounds in because it will probably overpower your perennial crops. You'll waste a lot of seed, you waste time, and the next year you'll kind of have to start over. So don't think that more is better. More is better in some things, but not Italian ryegrass. 5 tons per acre is what they got this with the alfalfa, tall fescue, and Italian ryegrass. Keep that rate low. So at maybe $1.50 would be a more expensive Italian ryegrass, $1.50 per pound. So if you're putting in 4 pounds per acre, $6. It's a pretty inexpensive component. Keep your eye on the perennials and the understory. Just get out there, find where's my alfalfa, where's my tall fescue. If it looks like it's struggling for light, take it off. Take off the top growth. And then take the last cut as late as you can if you want to give your Italian ryegrass a chance the next year. So reed canary. So this is reed canary planted with 4 pounds per acre of Italian ryegrass. This is reed canary grass alone. This is reed canary grass after it was planted with an oat pea companion. So this, in this case, we're treating the Italian ryegrass as a nurse crop in the same way that a lot of people treat the oat pea as a nurse crop. The big question I have is this spring, when the Italian ryegrass is gone, what is this going to look like? Was this too much competition for that canary grass? It was in there, but did it weaken it? Is it going to start later? Is it going to be a little thinner?
I don't come in the second, third year.
You know, I'm curious to see. The farmer on whose farm I put these plots was not a big fan of canary grass because he's tried it before. The seed's pretty pricey, and he just didn't show up. And
Slow to establish,
it's
and it won't take close cut. You could kill it by one.
too short. Okay. Well, in this case, with the shallow seeding depth and a very early planting, it was all there. I mean, there was no trouble getting it established, but it wasn't going to give you a yield that first year. And so that's the main reason you'd want to look at that. A person might also want to get just one more year out of an alfalfa field. I don't know if any of you grow alfalfa or not. You know, you might have autotoxicity, you might have winter kill. You say, I'm just going to go out there with some Italian ryegrass, no-till it. We'll get one more year out of this, and then I'm planning to put it in corn anyway. That's another application. We have a lot of ice treating this year too. So, you know, if you have fields that have been hammered by that, you could also go into those. Heavy use areas, another good spot for it. So this farm is in Cabot. This is an organic farm where they fed bales here late fall of 2014 and in the spring of 2015. And of course, you know, it's on a hill, so there's water coming out the side of the hill. It's a pretty big mess. He harrowed it a couple of times when he could. Put in broadcast with just a herd spreader, Italian ryegrass, maybe 40, 45 pounds per acre, and then started grazing it. His observation, he said that he didn't see a big bump in yield, milk yield, compared to if they were on oats or something like that, you know, high quality forage. But I think part of the trick is, are we slowing them down? You know, are we trying to manage that so that we're actually capturing that? And I don't know the trick for doing that in a grazing situation. It's more of a barn management type of thing when you're bringing them in. So you got to work with the nutritionist. Don't just treat it like another grass. I would test the portion that they're grazing because they don't. And it was always just a little bit of ahead of where you wanted it to be, and they were taking off. So if it was this tall, they were taking off about that much, which is going to test very differently than if I just clipped it down to the sort of the haylage harvest height. And find ways to slow it down in the digestive tract to get more out of it. I would not plant it in low rainfall areas, sandy soils. If there's a fertility problem that you can't fix or not willing to fix, if you have rented ground that you know that you can't risk fixing those fertility problems because they might sell it or rent it out to somebody else. If you're not willing to manage this aggressively, you're not going to see the value that you would if you're willing to aggressively manage it. Here's some with orchard grass. So we have orchard grass here, 12 pounds per acre, right in that center plot. This was October, same plot. This was orchard grass at 10 pounds per acre plus 4 pounds of Italian ryegrass. You know, you can't really tell a whole lot. This doesn't strike me as being, wow, that's way higher yielding. So the question is, why would you do that with an orchard grass or a tall fescue? And so here's a tall fescue with 14 pounds versus 9 pounds plus 4 pounds of Italian ryegrass. This to me looks visually different than that, but that doesn't really translate to yield necessarily. Reed canary grass, 8 pounds alone. Reed canary grass, 6 pounds plus 4 pounds of Italian ryegrass. Again, the proof will be this May, how things are looking. Anybody plant meadow fescue? Okay, it's very high quality, but it's going to yield a bit less than tall fescue. Pretty good for wet ground, and it has more susceptibility to foliar disease. So that's one of the situations where you'd want to pay attention on your fertility. So let's look at the yield data. There are a lot of numbers here, so just follow the cursor and try to show you the big picture. These are observations; they're not replicated studies. So when I say that with Italian ryegrass we got 1/3 of a ton more than without, that's not meaningful necessarily. And in some cases, you see that with perennial ryegrass, for example, we got more with just straight perennial ryegrass than we did when we mixed it with Italian. And meadow fescue, there was no apparent difference in yield. So you're not really doing it for yield, although I think in many cases visually you'll see less weed competition if you include Italian ryegrass just because of the competition that it's providing. So notice here, I have a line here, a dark line here. This is tall fescue inside these 2 lines. This is orchard grass into these inside these 2 lines. And the lines in bold have the Italian ryegrass in them. So with that, I want to show you differences. We can look at non-fiber carbohydrates generally with the Italian ryegrass. And it's a combination of things. We have different seeding rates, and we have Italian ryegrass versus none. I put the calcium over here. This is a trick Sid Bosworth taught me, because you see some of these had alfalfa, Kara clover. Some of them had red clover and other plots. If you have pure alfalfa, you'll have something like 1.5% calcium. If you have pure grass, you'll have more like 0.5% calcium. And so this is just to demonstrate that those legumes really weren't doing anything. So most of the yield that you see here is due to the grasses. We had a problem with boron and I think potato leafhoppers with the alfalfa. All right, so what I noticed was NDF digestibility with the Italian ryegrass was often 6 or more points higher. In this case, it's closer to 10 points, more than 10 points. And then meadow fescue is very high NDF digestibility, so the Italian ryegrass didn't help really in that case. And then this is the Italian ryegrass all by itself, 81% 30-hour NDF digestibility. And the same with total tract. You see a benefit at every point along the way. So you don't plant it for the yield necessarily, although I think it'll be a comparable yield to if you included a oat pea or triticale over the whole season, if you manage the fertility aggressively. But we still need to do more research to prove that. So a really logical question would be, is if I'm going to go ahead and plant Italian rye, why wouldn't I just plant perennial rye? That way I have every reason to believe if I plant a winter hardy perennial rye that I'm going to get something more second year, third year, maybe a fourth year out of it. That's a good question. It likes cool, wet environments. It's also very rapid to establish. Certain varieties do have winter hardiness, others don't. And really good forage quality. And the yield can be very good depending on the variety and management. And it works well with red clover. It works pretty well, I think, with alfalfa too. All right, so this is perennial ryegrass. This would be probably mid-May. This is October. This would be around June 15th. I think this is July 9th, something like that. So it works well for pastures. It does some self-reseeding. Some varieties struggle with crown rust. Some of them, they just don't know when to stop putting up seed heads. They want to put up a seed head and they want it to get to a certain maturity. Other varieties, they seem pretty satisfied once they get a seed head that gets up a little bit, they'll kind of give up and go back to vegetative growth. So you have to pick a good variety. And as a cover crop, It's not a substitute for cereal rye at all, not in our area. This is Michigan after wheat, and it looks okay. There it's with crimson clover, but again, you're planting that in August in that case. We're back to Italian ryegrass now. But it's going to winter kill, and here you're not going to get nearly that growth. It'll hardly do anything if you plant it at the same time that you plant your rye. It'll germinate, it'll be there, but it's not going to do much, and then it will probably die in the winter. I did try scratching some into the field between rows there in Haverhill, New Hampshire, 12th of June. I did that, corners about that stage, just curious to see what it would do as an in-season cover crop. And you can see, here we are, the 17th of June, had abundant rain. It's all there coming up. I did some rows where I just broadcasted as well. Just curious to see how that was going to do. July 9th, what is this? Is this a weed or is that an in-season cover crop, in your opinion? Does that make you nervous, or are you losing yield?
The canopy's really quick, you know, kind of go dormant for a while, so I don't think you lose much energy.
Okay. Yeah, there wasn't a clear problem. I didn't see these plants yellowing. Yeah, and you can see there's some burn there from the 32% that got put on the field as well, I think. All right, here we are, August 13th. That's looking pretty good as far as ground cover. You know, I think I have a program that you can take a picture and you can put a grid over it with 100 intersections, and you can count and find out how many of them are over a piece of vegetation, calculate percent cover. And one of them, I think I had something like 63%. So I was encouraged. Here's clover at the same time. I did the same thing with it, red clover. But August 27th, it started to crash. We got foliar disease, humidity, probably a little drier at that point in that topsoil. A lot of the nutrients were gone. It was just going downhill. And then September 28th, there's my cover crop. So not terribly inspiring at that point. I'm not saying that this represents what Italian or annual ryegrass can do. I'm not, you know, what's the best time to plant it? You know, there are a lot of questions that aren't answered. But I think if you planted it too early, it would be a weed. If you plant it at the next step, maybe it just can't survive that kind of darkness. And then I broadcast some in later. Oh, by the way, so these plants look like they're pretty much completely dead, but there was a molecule or two in the plant that was alive, and some of them came back. But compared to the cereal rye that was drilled over here, this is not inspiring. Okay. Various ways that you guys are familiar with to get it in there. This I broadcast between rows sometime in August in Waterford, Vermont, just kind of shaking it on there, and that looked better. It still wasn't super inspiring. Termination. If you want this stuff to die with normal herbicide program, you need to have, it needs to go through 5 to 7 days of consecutive good growing conditions, where the minimum temperature those days is 55 degrees. If night temperatures drop below 38, then you got to wait 3 more days, because that plant is saying, wait, it's cold, I'm going to kind of slow down here, and then you have trouble translocating that herbicide to the root. So soil temperature also needs to be about 45, and you just need to be careful if you're going to try to use this in a cover crop system, or if you're trying to spray something out. So some of those plants will survive the winter. So if you're going back to corn, you need to be on the ball and know what conditions you need to make that custom guy effective, so he doesn't have to come out there again. So you want to spray at least 4 hours before sunset so it gets translocated. Herbicide antagonism can be important. I'm not sure which herbicides. Sometimes if you're trying to mix a gramoxone, which is a desiccant, with a Roundup type of product, you burst all those cells, and then you don't translocate the Roundup down to the root because you just killed the top growth. So that might be what they're referring to. This website is a great resource, and herbicide resistance is important. This part of the country is where a lot of the seed production is done. So you have resistance to 3 different classes of herbicides here in Oregon. And then sort of in the southeast, you have resistance to 1, 2, 3 different classes of herbicides, 5 different groups altogether. So that's just for your information. Down here, they've raised it for years and years and years as a sort of something that might graze through the winter. And then, of course, they want to go into a crop. They've been spraying it with something to kill it, so you can understand out of the millions of seeds out there, you're going to find 1 or 2 that is resistant. And that seems to be what's
So
happened.
if you got that as your cover
Yeah.
and you no-till,
Uh-huh.
you're better off to try to kill it before you no-till.
I mean, I'm a fan of killing even regular cereal rye when it's about that tall, as opposed to when it's that tall. I would look at the weather conditions. If you're trying to kill this as a companion crop, as a perennial crop, say that it survived the winter, just look at the weather. Follow those guidelines as to how many days of good growing conditions and those overnight temperatures and how far away from sunset you are. Those are more important, in my opinion, than pretty much anything else. Although you still want to do it early.
Mm.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, if you have to choose. Okay.
It's like once you got it, you got it.
Well, I mean,
Well, that's big, Ryegrass is big out in the Midwest. No-till guys. But they said
you got to be careful.
trying to stop killing it.
Yeah, it doesn't die quite as easily. So I personally would be more inclined to use it in a rotation with corn than I would be just to try to use it as a cover. Try it on a small scale before you go whole hog. If you want to try to get any seed, let me know. I know the seed companies are interested in having people try it, and often they'll share some seed on that basis. So
How palatable is it versus other grasses that usually throw a rail bale situation? Sharp.
no, the blade's not sharp. I think as far as texture, I think that it's fine. As far as overall palatability, I think if you taste it, which as one farmer who likes to taste the grass, it tastes like spinach. So I don't know. I mean, will the cow find it palatable with the high non-fiber carbohydrates, the high starch sugar levels? Probably. I think the bigger thing is if they feel off afterwards because it's flying through them too fast, that might educate them, in the other direction. If they're grazing it in a ration, you're going to be balancing your ration anyway for certain levels of NDF. So I think if you're putting some scratch factor in there and have enough effective fiber, that you'll be fine.